Okay. We live in Ohio, and they say that there are two seasons, winter and road construction. And this year is particularly bad in that it seems like everywhere I go, there's orange barrels everywhere. And I post on my Facebook page. By the way, if you want to friend me on Facebook, I still have some room for more friends. And um, you have to express undying devotion. I mean, no, you just have to tell me. It would help if you send me a private message and say I watch Prophecy Update, and I'm not a troll or something like that. So I'm just trying to get a passage up here. I've been up since about 2 o'clock this morning, trying to get this stuff done. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment as I go through. But I posted on my Facebook page the other day that there's this. I was wondering, do orange barrels cause some people to go into like a seizure or something? Because I don't mind slowing down. That's not the point. That's not the major point. But it's the people changing lanes and not looking, and they think they can do anything in that construction zone. It's like a zone of protection. It's a construction zone. It's not. That's where you need to be extra careful. And that's the point. So we had these construction barrels, orange barrels in Bible prophecy that are telling us that there are things coming up. They're warnings. And sometimes they're a warning for us to kind of slow down and take some caution. On the way up here this morning, I was trying to turn on Route 23 off of the freeway, and there was a lady in front of me, and she had 3 bumper stickers on her car. One was one of those equal signs, just with an equal sign for equality. And then there was that coexist thing, and then evolved. And I was pretty sure that she was not on her way to Fellowship Bible Chapel, unless she was a recent convert. We give people time to clean all the junk off their car here at church. We're not legalistic or anything. But boy, what a week. It was a great week to look at things that are converging. So I'm going to look at a little bit at culture, geopolitics, Israel this week. I'm going to make 3 recommendations up front of other places to check, just because, as you know, it's not possible to cover everything in an hour that we have here, an hour or so. And one is the Chaim Report, CHAIM, JerusalemJournal.net/headlines. Chaim Report by Brian Schrager, where he does a great job of updating Middle East news, things relative to the Middle East, headlines there, does it 6 days a week. And it's really an excellent resource, one that I check. Another one, watch.org, of course, our friend Bill Koenig. That's another good one to check, so I'm actually going to recommend 4. Another one is, yesterday, Jan Markell interviewed Michelle Bachmann on her radio show, Understanding the Times, that you can get at olivetreeviews.org. And it was a really good interview. They talked about Islam and immigration, and Michelle brought out some very good points. She studied the topic extensively. And again, it's one of those things, I'll refer you to that resource because I don't have time to go into it. And then another good resource, and I'll make some reference to it later on, Jacob Prash, our friend Jacob, has been doing a prophecy update when he can do it each week. And so go to Moriel TV YouTube channel and you can see what he talked about. And he brought up a couple good points, and I'll refer to a couple of those today. I may pull something out of Jan's show at the same time. But those are all good resources that you should check in addition to anything here. So let's get started. I don't talk much about the economy. I work with banks a lot, and I can just tell you is that Columbus is a bubble in terms of the economy and that type of thing. It's pretty good here. It's good in a lot of parts of the United States, but there are other places where it's just not that good. And in EU, they have, for example, in France and a number of other European countries, they have about 3.5% of their commercial loans are non-performing. The United States is about 1.2%, and it's at a point where people are concerned about the banking system here. So triple the non-performing loan rate. and you have an idea what's going on in the European Union, and I don't see, right now I don't see a way out of it. I know the Fed's pulling back a lot of money on their quantitative easing, and the banks are going to have to pay back money, and so the banks are they're very nervous right now. And if nothing happens, they're going to go back to doing the things that got us in trouble at a really high level in 2008. I mean, at a high volume level. So I just think at some point these things always have. It's hard to say this when stock markets that are all-time record highs and that sort of thing, but you just need to be aware that that's happening. And the EU is taking the step right now. This was just on Reuters yesterday, that they're looking for ways to freeze accounts so people can't go get all their money out of the bank. So you just need to be aware of those things. This is a situation that is looming. Disappearance of fertile land is causing a crisis across Africa. There's a lot of people that live there. It's a huge continent, way bigger than the United States, much, much larger. And the land's being used up, and there are millions and millions of people. I think Lagos, Nigeria, is one of the largest cities on planet Earth. Nigeria will soon, over the next decade or so, at current growth rates, it'll exceed the population of the United States. So these are not inconsequential countries, but a lot of times we have a tendency to forget about them. So that's just another thing, because look, the Bible tells us one of the seals involves famine that's open, and we see all the conditions being set up for that. We see major droughts in a lot of places. It's interesting. Now this is. I'm always interested. I do look at the New York Times and Washington Post and other news things, and this is on the editorial page in the Sunday Review section of the New York Times this morning, and the title of the editorial or op-ed or article is "When Life on Earth Nearly Vanished." Now, I find this interesting from a creation evolution perspective, because they say that 300 million years ago, I'll just pick out one of the numbers they talk about, there was a mass extinction on the planet. 90% of ocean life and 75% of land life was exterminated in this catastrophe or the climate change. Now, and the reason I always look at this is, evolution says, well, over billions of years, things have changed. And now we have this vast diversity of life because we've had this long, long period of time. But you're killing 75% of land and 90% of ocean life 300 million years ago. All that life has to come back and evolve, doesn't it? Again? And there's not enough time. I mean, this is the way I look at it and analyze it. If you need a lot of time, your model cuts the time way down. And so, I mean, you want to talk about believing in, have a religious belief about how things can happen miraculously, you have it. So just always be on the lookout for those things. This is the Washington Post this morning, Ann Applebaum. She's a lefty, but I thought it was interesting what she said was that the threat from artificial intelligence may already be here. We think about robots, and I think there was news this week that there was a robot that started to invent its own language, and they had to close it down at some research facility because they were concerned about that. And this is what they've been talking about happening. And even guys like Elon Musk from Tesla, he talks about his concerns. Mark Zuckerberg was on Facebook this week saying, oh, he's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. This technology and artificial intelligence will be great. But, to their credit, there are people on all sides of the political spectrum or all points on the political spectrum that are concerned about what are we doing and what are the ethics. And we should rely on your good ethics when you don't have any ethical base to go on, like you don't believe in a God or scripture or anything like that. I'm very concerned about that. And she says this: no one is really able to explain the way they all interact. And she's talking about these bots. These bots are things that do what humans do. And so they send out these massive amounts of emails. Or I'm sure they control, I'm sure you get the phone calls like we do that look like they're coming from your own area code, even the exchange of your cell phone number. And so you answer it, and it's somebody wanting to, change the interest rate on your credit card or get rid of your student loan. I'm like, I didn't have any student loans, and I've been out of school for 40 years, so, leave me alone. And you can't call back. You can't ever. So these things, they do this stuff, and it's automated. So she says no one is ever really able to explain the way they all interact or what the impact of both real and artificial online campaigns might be on the way people think or form opinions. She's looking at how they're used in the campaign, like Trump used them and what's her name used them. Another digital forensic research lab investigation into pro-Trump and anti-Trump bots showed that an extraordinary number of groups that are involved in these dueling conversations, some commercial, some political, some foreign. The conclusion, they are distorting the conversation, but toward what end, nobody knows. Which is my point. Maybe we've all been imagining the scenario incorrectly all of this time. Maybe this is what computers out of control really look like. There's no giant spaceship, nor are there armies of lifelike robots. Instead, we have created a swamp of unreality, a world where you don't know whether the emotions you are feeling are manipulated by men or machines, and where, once all the news moves online, as it surely will, it will soon be impossible to know what's real and what's imagined. Isn't this the dystopia that we've so long feared? Now, listen, she's a person of the left, and I don't think she's religious, but I don't know. Let's assume she's not. Do you understand the significance of people in the culture that are talking about the things that line up with Bible prophecy? Because we know that there's somebody coming, the man of sin, the son of perdition, and will deceive many. And he will use technology to do that. And it will be very deceptive. And you see it all the time, too. I mean, I get hit with these headlines from people, and it's just like, think about it for 1 second before you share it. Look at it, Google it, and see if it's true. It's not going to, a fake news site doesn't have, fake news for Americans, for gullibleamericans.com. It might be something that's a little bit more subtle. And at the bottom, a lot of times they say, this is just speculation and satire or something like that. So, but listen, people believe it because they see it and they read it, and there's a picture with it, and it kind of seems true. There's a satire site called Babylon Bee, it's almost too good because good satire is hard to distinguish from the truth, so, they'll have, you can go look at Babylon Bee and know that it's all made up. Every single one of those is satire, not real. So I'm not going to share them here. We have this political chaos in our country. This is a letter from the Congress to Jeff Sessions asking that Rod Rosenstein, that another special counsel be established to investigate things relative to the Clinton actions in the last campaign. So we'll see how that will go. I mean, Sessions seems to be frozen a little bit. He's getting criticized by the president. This would be a way he could step up and move this thing forward. I don't know if you've heard this scandal about the Pakistani immigrant Muslim brothers who were running a lot of security for people in the IT security for people in the House of Representatives, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz when she was chairman of the Democratic National Committee. And my understanding is they finally have been told they'll get access to her hard drive after all these months of asking for it to look at it. But they found a number of hard drives that were smashed that they're looking into. And there were three brothers. They were paid $160,000 a year. The average federal worker at that level might make around $40,000. These guys were paid $160,000. They had access to all the sensitive information. They're wiring money overseas. And one tried to leave, the country while he was under investigation, and he was arrested, I believe, at the airport. He had just wired hundreds of thousands of dollars back to Pakistan. And, nobody on the Democratic side will talk about this. This is a massive scandal. And, do you see this on the news every night? Really. Jared Kushner gets an email, and there's 5 pages in the Washington Post about it. This is scandalous. And it from a prophecy standpoint, it just shows how lawless our society has become. It's crazy. So there is somebody looking into, and I checked this out as best as I could, so I will put it with a qualifier that I may be wrong, but I checked sources that I trust. There is somebody at the Department of Justice that's in charge of the investigation into these Pakistani brothers and the things that they've done. And it's a huge number of crimes that they're being investigated for. And the person that's investigating that happens to be the brother of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the one in charge, or at least on the team. That's scandalous, right? Can we agree on that? It's shocking. And nobody out there will talk about it. You will not hear this, I guarantee you, on CNN. I don't even know if you'll hear it on Fox. I don't know if you'll hear it on, I just don't think you'll hear it in the mainstream media. This is, and I always hesitate to do this because I know there are people who dearly love the president, but there's some things that are happening that I'm concerned about. And one of them is that McMaster, there was a guy named Derek Harvey, who people who know him tell me he's a phenomenal guy, but he's very much concerned. They call him an Iran hawk, which means he's concerned about what Iran is doing. And he's now been forced out of the National Security Council by McMaster. He was essentially fired. And that concerns me because they're leaving Obama holdovers in place, and they're forcing out good people like Harvey. And I'm only asking the question is, what is going on? What is Rex Tillerson doing? I don't know that he's doing anything. Now, there's some suggestion in the New York Times this morning that, they're gutting state and they're gutting other departments. I just don't see it. I still see the same things coming out. So, now, bad Trump, good Trump. I'm glad that the president came out this week and said, we're not going to have transgender people serving in the military. Well, it's created a firestorm. Even the military is coming out and saying, well, this was a surprise to us. They just asked for a 6-month moratorium on this, and now these Joint Chiefs are going, which shows you that at the top military brass like that, they're very political animals. You need to understand that. That's sometimes how they get promoted all the way up, especially to the top. They have to know how to manage the political aspect. So, they'll stick their finger in the wind just like anybody else, and they see that a lot of people really support this. And I know there's military people here or ex-military. This is crazy. And the reaction to it was like, this was the New York Daily News, Commander in Hate. And somebody here said, I feel like I've just been punched in the gut. I served in the Army for 11 years. And during the last 2 years, I was openly transgender, but now I just feel like I've been punched in the gut. Now, the interesting thing, I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter, but I saw this. This is from Lady Gaga. And she says, POTUS, sincerely, did you know that the group you singled out today, 45% of them ages 18 to 24, have attempted suicide already? And the implication was, you're going to cause more suicides by not letting these people into the military. But wait a minute. There are a whole host of things that exclude you from the military. Flat feet, arthritis, bad knees, too tall, too heavy, too short, not strong enough. And the question that comes up in the military context is, if you have a guy who comes in as a man and then changes to the woman. There are different standards for how much you can carry and how fast you can run. And I see one of our military guys back there shaking his head, yes, I'm right, aren't I? And so there are different standards for men and women, especially when you get into the combat forces and special forces thing. And so a guy comes in, and he's not doing so well and keeping up with his standards, so I'm going to be a woman. And does he get to go with the female standards? And what it does is it causes chaos in the military for that reason alone. But then you have people, psychological problems are a ground for exclusion from military service. But Lady Gaga, she just sees it for the political correct thing. And somebody did respond to her. There were hundreds of responses, like Cliff for Trump saying, "Great point, Gaga. You just explained why Obama banned this fragile group for 7 years, then planted the landmine for Trump. Perfect sense." Obama planted these little bombs, time bombs, to go off, and this is one of them. In England, let me see if I have, I may have my slides slightly out of order. Well, so in England, what happened is there is this report that came out from it's sort of a government agency called Wilton Park, and it says, opportunities and challenges, the intersection of faith and human rights of LGBTI plus persons. Now, it was issued last fall, but they're putting in these regulations, and they want, well, look at what some of these things say. Executive summary: LGBTI plus people face in varying degrees in different parts of the world hatred, prejudice, and discrimination from people of faith. This is a government organization. In some cases, this includes violence and has resulted in deaths. These negative attitudes and behaviors are often inspired by leaders who use religious texts to justify them. Now, I have major problems with this, especially some person in Theresa May's government. And this is a conservative government that's putting these things out. And essentially what they want to do is they want to do this. A strategy is needed to tackle this serious global problem. The approach will vary from place to place according to local traditions, cultural norms, and needs, but common components include challenging the interpretation of sacred texts. Sounds like the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America or some of the Mennonites. Promoting inclusive explanations of the value of human rights, finding champions and allies to hold dialogues with faith, influencing and educate, that's the Hegelian dialectic, to dumb down the faith, influencing and educating people of faith, champions and allies, and confronting hatred. Recommendations: understanding of key religious texts which appear to perpetuate discrimination should be improved by using well-reputed scholarly texts to challenge accepted versions, e.g., the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from Genesis chapter 19. A good example of thoughtful scholarly based on this discussion is Breaking Open Sodom and Gomorrah, a 2016 booklet by Soul Force, which is a radical left-wing pro-homosexual organization. So this is where the government is going. Talks about queer theology, feminist theology, and a theology of inclusion need wider currency, particularly in seminaries, in order to inform discussions around faith and LGBTI plus issues. Feminist theology can be used to challenge the gender ideology of the religious right. So that's what it's going. They want to break down people's faith, and they don't care. Now, Melanie Phillips wrote a long article. I will share a little bit of it, called the Tory Jacobins. And she says, the reason why conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic have lost their way so badly in recent years is they never understood and paid scant attention to the culture wars. In Britain, this has now led some of them to come out as warriors on the wrong side. Conservatism is not an ideology, but is an attitude of mind. It involves identifying and holding on to what is most valuable and defending it against erosion or attack. In the 18th century, this was embodied in the thinking of Edmund Burke, widely considered to be the philosophical godfather of conservative thought, when he defended freedom and human rights against the barbarism of the French Revolution. And it was barbaric. And so she says, we used to fight the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union collapsed, and the conservatives, they just sort of stopped fighting. on moral principles. And so now they've destroyed it. She goes, instead of, in the middle there, instead of the workers seizing control of the levers of economy, the left would now seize control of the levers of the culture, the universities, media, civil service, churches, the legal profession, and subvert them from within. Its aim was to undermine and weaken the normative values of the West and then flip them so that what was transgressive became normative, while what was normative became ostracized as transgressive. In other words, you oppose this, you're the sinner in the new morality, not the people that are doing it. And so this is the way the West would be destroyed and would be transformed into quite what was never very clear, but some kind of new world order. Do you see the connection there between what Bible prophecy says and what's going on in the culture? I think Melanie makes a very close connection to it. So you can get her stuff at melaniephillips.com. And look, she's not perfect. She's not a believer. She concludes her article by this: when same-sex marriage was introduced, we were told the church would remain free to stick to its traditional doctrines. Given that the distinction between men and women is now being destroyed by legislative fiat, we can all see what freedom of religion and freedom in general actually means to these Tory Jacobins. What a betrayal. Burke must be revolving in his grave. Great article. You might want to look at it. And then this week, to get to Israel and some other geopolitics, you see attacks on Israel all the time. For example, this is the World Council of Churches, and they all talk about we need to have dialogue about access to holy spaces, particularly in Jerusalem, and we need to resolve the occupation. They always talk about the occupation. They rarely discuss the terrorism. They might mention it to seem like they're fair. Here's the Mennonite Church USA. They've now voted. They have some, I don't know if this conference has taken place yet, Seeking Peace in Israel-Palestine. And there's they have all these videos of people talking about how they've become concerned about social justice, particularly justice involving the Palestinians and Israel. So listen to what he says. This is a Mennonite guy. I mean, I grew up Mennonites. We used to go to a Mennonite church sometimes because they had a big hymn sing on Sunday night, you know. Roughly half of the country is watching a movie with an outsider president whose unpredictability is needed to facilitate change. Oh, by the way, and a lot of Mennonites are still holding fast. I want you to know this is just one organization. A lot of Mennonites have left because this group has adopted same-sex marriage. It's an action movie, he says. The other half is watching a dystopian drama with a president who is an incompetent, corrupt, morally bankrupt, aspiring despot who is overseeing the collapse of democracy and the rise of totalitarianism. So what do we say when we see that? He's projecting. He's putting what he believes on somebody else. So they have these resolutions, Seeking Peace in Israel. Here's just one. We have heard the cry for justice of Palestinians, especially those living under oppressive military occupation for 50 years. We are also acutely aware of anti-Semitism. See how they try to balance it out in violence inflicted upon Jews in the past and present. The suffering of those two groups too often has been set against the other. We recognize, rather, that the legacy of Jewish suffering is intertwined with the suffering of Palestinians. So one of their commitments, engaging Christian Zionism. We urge pastors, teachers, and appropriate church agencies to engage Christian Zionism with our own church and with the broader American Christian community, encourage Christian Zionists to enter into a conversation relationship with our Palestinian Christian partners, and as followers of Jesus to pursue a nonviolent, inclusive, and just vision for Jewish and Palestinian coexistence in the Holy Land. I don't believe that that's what their end game is. And then here's what they came in and they said: avoiding economic support for occupation while investing in peace and justice. And you can look this up at the Mennonite, I think it's MennoniteUSA.org is the website. I ran across this a little bit, just one little comment out of it. Bridge Building to Nowhere. This was put out by the Center for Security Policy about how's the Catholic Church doing. And everybody says you need to have interfaith dialogue with Islam. And we see examples of it happening all the time. And this looked at what the Catholic Church has done, and their conclusion was they had failed miserably. In fact, they have one section titled, "It's Feed My Sheep, Not Feed My Sheep to the Wolves." And that's what some people seem to forget in that whole conversation. This is Ivanka Trump. Yesterday, Jan Markell and Michelle Bachmann talked a lot about a lady named Ann Corcoran. RefugeeWatch.blogspot.com, I think, is her blog. And she's been tracking this for years, and she was like, where are all these people coming from? She lives in rural Tennessee, and all of a sudden, a couple hundred Muslim refugees show up, and then another couple hundred, and how they get, they're getting paid, and there's organizations. 6 of them are religious related. 9 contractors and several hundred subcontractors, a lot of which are churches, religious organizations, NGOs that have been set up to get government money to resettle refugees. And one of the conditions, my understanding is, you can't proselytize. So, everybody always talks about, well, we're going to have interfaith dialogue, but you're really not allowed to. So I would recommend, and this is Ivanka Trump, she's meeting with Guterres, and Guterres, before he became head of the UN, remember, he was sort of head of the UN refugee program. And so he's the one who's been pushing it, and now he's at the head of the UN. And we see what it's doing to Europe, and I'm concerned of what it's going to do to America. And a lot of this, the standards for how this refugee program works at the UN level, was set up by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 Muslim governments that are talking about how we're going to do Muslim immigration. And that is one of the ways of jihad is immigration. So, let's see. Well, this I saw that the State Department lawyers are removing references to ISIS, genocide against Christians and other religious minorities. The State Department has come out and said, no, that's not true. We're doing everything okay. So let's look at Israel and geopolitics for a little bit. So we know that 2 weeks ago there was a terrorist attack on the Temple Mount. 2 Israeli police were killed in an area near the Lion's Gate by 3 terrorists who were shot and killed, and that led to a lot of things happening. First of all, Israel said, well, this shouldn't be happening. They found a large number of weapons and knives and some other guns up in the areas, hidden in areas of the Temple Mount. So they confiscated them, and they said, we need to make sure everybody's safe. And we're going to reopen it for worship, so we're going to put in metal detectors. And the Muslim Waqf protested, had people protesting in the streets, refusing to go to the Temple Mount. There were violent clashes. There were at least 4 Arabs referred to as Palestinians, killed in those exchanges. There was a terrorist who went and stabbed and killed 3 members of a Jewish family at Shabbat dinner on Friday night, a week ago Friday. And the whole thing has kind of spun out of control. There was a good article of Bloomberg View about how 1929 dispute frames today's Temple Mount conflict. And what happened back in 1929, and I've talked a bit about Hebron because Pam and I were there 2 months ago, and it really, the conflict, which I knew about and I'd seen before, having been to Israel, but going to Hebron really brought it into a different focus for me to see the stark division that's down there and the security things that are in place and the military patrols and the no man's land. And soldiers asking you when you go through the checkpoint, do you have any knives? Because they've been stabbed and killed at that checkpoint. And at Hebron, at the giant Herodian structure that's over the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried, for a lot of years, the Jews were not allowed to go past the 7th step. You go up 7 steps and there's a landing, and then you go up a little bit further. They weren't allowed to go past that 7th step for a long period of time. And in 1929, what happened was the Grand Mufti started a rumor that the Jews were going to take over the Temple Mount. And the result of that was, I think about 250 Jews were slaughtered, murdered, including about 69 in Hebron in one attack in 1929. And this is the headline from the Baltimore newspaper that night. And you can see the steps there with the blood at the synagogue. So the Mufti, and then what happened was that it was clear at that time that the most radical Arabs were in Hebron because of this tension. You know, because there was a synagogue there was a mosque there over the cave of Machpelah. So what the Mufti did was he took a lot of these radicals and sort of sprinkled them through Judea and Samaria, what other people call the West Bank, to foment this thing. So this goes back, what all you saw going on at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem the last 2 weeks has been festering and really started back in 1929 in earnest. And it's continued. We've had wars in 48 and 1967 and 1973. We've had peace agreements. We've had negotiations. All this has been going on. But it's been going on for close to 90 years. And I'll have some comments about the end. So this article goes on. I don't really... Go to Bloomberg View and you can find it. It also references a book by Hillel Cohen called Year Zero of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1929. And this is a picture in 1929 of Jews fleeing through the Jaffa Gate because they felt they were at risk for being attacked by people stoked up by the Mufti and the rumors that he was saying. So this has been going on for a long, long time. And this seems to be one of the most irresolvable conflicts. You won't be surprised to hear what really caused the 1929 events is a complex, contested historical question unto itself. But most accounts agree that the one important trigger was a fight about the placement of a mechitza, or gender-dividing barrier, at the site of the Western Wall during Jewish prayers on the Day of Atonement in September 1928. And it just kind of spun out of control from there. And at the time, there wasn't a big Kotel Plaza or Western Wall Plaza in Jerusalem. It was just essentially an alleyway. And when the Jews were banned from there in 1948 after the war, when Jerusalem was divided into Israel's side and Jordan's controlled side, they turned that into a garbage dump. And the Jews were not allowed to go there until 1967 when they got control of the whole city and the Temple Mount. But they gave control over the Temple Mount area to the Muslim authorities, really to Jordan, who ceded it to the Muslim authorities. But in the overall scheme of things, I think Israel really controls this. So this is a major problem. It's so major that this is the UN Security Council meeting this week in New York, where what was the topic? The topic was the UN Security Council, rising tensions amid crisis in Jerusalem, threaten Israel, Palestine with vortex of violence, religious conflict, special coordinator warns Security Council. Swift, decisive action was required to revive negotiations in the crisis in Jerusalem and beyond, before rising tensions dragged both Israel and Palestine into a vortex of violence and religious conflict. The special coordinator of the Middle East process told the Security Council today. And this is just a quote of what he said.
That while events in Jerusalem may be taking place over a couple of hundred square meters in the old city, they affect hundreds of millions of people around the world.
Now, that's interesting because it's 38 acres, roughly, and it affects the whole world. Do you get the Bible prophecy connection there? Because we know that, Joel Rosenberg's written books called Epicenter. It's about this particular area. And it is the epicenter. This was interesting. I don't have any quotes from him. The state of Palestine, a representative from the state of Palestine. That was his nameplate at the UN this week. I didn't know there was one. News to me. So we live, so do you see, when you go back to Annie Applebaum article about artificial intelligence and being fed these things and these pictures and these images, a lot of people will see that and they'll say, yeah, there is a state of Palestine. What's the fight over? I don't get it. And it's very pervasive, but it's false, it's a lie, it's a narrative that they've set up to deceive people into doing things. Danny Danon got up and he went through a long litany. He has the gentleman to his right, to the left there. He brought victims of Palestinian terror. This man was blinded in a terror attack. And he came and spoke at the UN. You can find that online if you want to listen to it. And he went through, and one of the points that he made was, hey, they are paying terrorists and their families $300 million a year. Some of it American taxpayer money to support terrorists and reward them for what they've done. 30% of the public money, maybe more, that the Palestinian Authority gets from around the world is used to pay off terrorists who've engaged in terrorist attacks, or if they've been killed, their families. That's, as Danny Danon said, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, that's morally bankrupt. So afterwards, there was a press conference, and a Palestinian representative was asked a question about the terror attack. Here we go.
Could you say a few words in reaction to the attack on the family on Friday night, the Salomon family? Surely you can't condone that kind of violent attack.
Don't expect all Palestinians to be angels not to react. If people think that the Palestinian people are going to live that situation without any form of resistance to it, that is not realistic and that is not fair.
Okay? Really? So the situation, there was demands that they remove the new security gear, and so somewhere in midweek, the metal detectors were taken down. They were going to put up cameras, and then the Mufti said, nope, nobody's coming to worship until you take everything down, because it's our Temple Mount, and we're not going to go up there. We're going to continue to demonstrate in the street, and we're going to have, these clashes almost always erupt into violence. On Thursday, they finally came back to the Temple Mount, and they rioted up on the Temple Mount. Now, King Abdullah from Jordan says this threatens the whole region, it threatens the whole world. Palestinian leaders were saying it's going to be an explosion if nothing changes. And then they took everything away, and it still sort of exploded. And so it's still very volatile. People are still very concerned about it. The dozens injured as Muslims return to mosque. There's a picture of them on the right praying on Friday at the Temple Mount. By the way, the best research I have found is that the mosque there on the Temple Mount, I know a number of you have been there, doesn't point to Mecca. Did you know that? Almost all the early mosques of Islam don't point to Mecca. Jay Smith has a great talk that he did at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills. You can look that up, called The Mecca Problem, or The Problem with Mecca. And he goes through and, he takes satellite images, and they all pointed, guess where? Petra in Jordan. So if you go to the Temple Mount, Petra's here, and it doesn't take much to get you off on a different course. But almost every one of the early mosques pointed to Petra. And so the question is, why? What was going on? Did this really come from Mecca? Is a question. Naftali Bennett was very upset about and people were very upset with Netanyahu for taking away all the security measures. Bennett, he did come out and say, look, I'm part of the cabinet. I voted against it, but I'll take responsibility. He didn't come out and criticize Netanyahu. Other members of the Knesset and others did come out, and they were very, very critical of Benjamin Netanyahu. And the different surveys that surveyed public opinion was somewhere between 67 and 77% of the people didn't like what Netanyahu did. So the question becomes, why did he do it? There was also an attack at the Israeli embassy in Amman, Jordan. That resulted in all of the Israeli staff from the embassy being pulled back, and Netanyahu hugged the guy that shot the terrorist in Amman and killed him, and now Abdullah's all upset. Now, Abdullah is in a pretty weak position. He has all those Syrian refugees. He has all the Palestinian refugees that have been there, and they're probably half of the country's population. The Syrian refugees are maybe 20% of the population. So his tribe is a smaller percentage than it's ever been. So he's very weak, very vulnerable. And he may be doing this just as sort of, like he says bad things about Jews all the time, and we always sort of ignore him like it's all okay. And remember, for centuries, his family was in charge of Mecca and Medina until the Saudi Arabian family sort of forced them out, so they gave him a kingdom up in Jordan, the Hashemites. So he's, it's hard to say what's going on there. He was doing this, I think, as a political gesture. So they removed the security gear. Here's just a little news report on what happened.
Prompted this decision? Any official word?
No official word on what prompted this decision, but look, we've had a week of escalating violence in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. Violent protests that left a number of Palestinians dead, a terror attack which the terrorists explicitly justified with reference to defending Al-Aqsa Mosque. And it was clear to Israel that we couldn't have yet another Friday in which Palestinians are refusing to enter the Temple Mount because of these metal detectors. Every day that this passes raises extra potential for another terror attack, another violent riot, and these are situations that Israel is clearly desperate to avoid. So instead, Israel's saying those metal detectors are going to go. In fact, we're seeing reports they're being taken down at this very moment in the dead of night. Israel's going to heighten the security presence, and then over the course of 6 months, Israel's going to implement a 100 million shekel or $28 million plan to install special smart inspection techniques, which, from what we understand from media reports, are going to include special cameras that are able to detect concealed weapons without needing a physical inspection.
Now, Elon, this is what the Palestinians had been protesting for. Has there been any reaction from them on this decision to remove the metal detectors?
I haven't seen any response from the Palestinians just yet. Let's remember the decision was only announced about an hour ago, and it's the middle of the night here in Israel.
Right. Elon Levy, thank you so much for...
Okay, so that was on the... well, that was about a week ago. So there were all these headlines. It's Friday came and there were no riots on the Temple Mount. They had their prayers, but there's demonstrations going on in Jaffa and over in Amman, Jordan. There's a lot of demonstrations going on, and it's very tense. And they're complaining about these security measures that were put in place that didn't prevent them from coming to the Temple Mount. It prevented them from coming and carrying, a weapon or a machine gun or an Uzi or something up there on the Temple Mount, or a knife, but it didn't really change their access. So Friday came and went, and things were pretty peaceful. And other people, Jews continued to go into Temple Mount. I know Ari Abramowitz went up there to pray, and he was arrested, like Jeremy had. Look, this is going to continue to be a flashpoint. It's not going to change. It's all part of the end time scenario. And Muslims do this. Look, these are the signs going into Mecca. No entry for non-Muslims. Entry, you're not allowed to go there. Do they restrict entry? Yeah. They're having the Hajj. And they came out in one of the Saudi paper and they said, oh, look at we have all this new, spent $100 million or something on new security for the Hajj this year with metal detectors and security cameras and all of that to control entry and egress from the mosque in Medina and Mecca. Does it sound a little bit hypocritical? No, it doesn't. It sounds a lot hypocritical. But look, they don't want anything associated with the Jews to be there, but they're denying history. Now, why were things so quiet on the Temple Mount on Friday? I'm going to suggest to you, I saw this video. Ari Fold put it up. Here's just it starts off at the Temple Mount. The audio will come up in just a minute. There's a bus there. Probably don't have it on. This is at the hotel, and there's a bus. If you look at the bus, Ariel explained what's going on.
So again, those of you looking right behind me, I'm here at the hotel, and the Border Patrol police went up onto the Temple Mount and arrested a whole bunch of terrorists here who are hiding up there ready to do some trouble tomorrow morning.
Now this is late Thursday night, so Shabbat and Friday morning prayers, before Friday morning prayers, and then Shabbat on Friday night.
They're now being loaded on the bus. You can see the bus windows are covered now with boxes and curtains. And again, those of you anywhere around the world who think that this was a metal detector or some other junky story like that, this is just pure Islamic hatred towards Jews. Everything was given up, unfortunately, disgusting way. Everything was given up, and yet they're still up there. They just arrested these terrorists. They're still up there right now, and they're being put in the bus right now, be taken out of the area.
And so they were talking about maybe 100 arrested. They brought in an Israeli jail bus, and they were very careful not to let you see anybody on the bus or anybody. So they brought in this big bus and another one to take away people. So maybe nothing happened. I don't know. I'm just saying it sounds like what Ari said was true, that they had to go up there and arrest. He said about 100 terrorists was the word that was passing around the Kotel Plaza that night, because they had stuff. They had rocks and that type of thing that they were going to throw down on the Jews the next day. And there were some rocks thrown down. There were several that were injured. So it's still a volatile situation. I think it's going to continue to be a volatile situation. Jordan King came out and said, well, I think that the U.S. helped negotiate a resolution. The report now is the boss may be in very deteriorating health. That's got everybody nervous. Here was an editorial cartoon about Netanyahu caving in to the Palestinians. Here's Melanie Phillips and Avi Avigor talking in Jerusalem a little bit, just a couple minutes of this.
This is the other strange thing about, it seems to me, about Israel, which I puzzle about a great deal. I mean, Israel is, it's a Middle Eastern country. Right. You would think that the Israelis would know better than anybody about the values and the mores of the Middle East, which are not the values and mores of the West. And the values and mores of the Arab Muslim world is the strong horse principle, that if in the West we believe that all problems should be met by compromise, negotiation and compromise, that people have to sort of give, and then the other side gives back. In the Arab Muslim world, it doesn't work like that. If you give, you are weak, and then we can come in to kill you. So the Israelis should know that, and to stand up and say, whatever the reason was that they took these barriers down is another issue, which maybe we'll talk about, but to stand up and say it was a mistake is to stand up and say, yeah, we are weak, we got it wrong. It's such an advertisement of weakness. You would think that it was unbelievably stupid to say this anywhere, but to say it in the Middle East, I really cannot understand what they're thinking of that. And you think they would know all that, and I think Prime Minister Netanyahu does know all that, and something strange happened over this, but we don't know. We don't know. Let's frame what we're going to say against the fact that we don't know. But what we do know is that on the Sunday, he was reported as saying the metal detectors are going to stay. 2 days later, they're gone. What happened? Well, maybe it's a coincidence, but what happened was that President Trump's envoy, Jason Greenblatt, came into town, and there was a discussion that went on, a negotiation between Israel and Jordan and the Americans. And after that, the metal barriers came down. Now, was that a coincidence? It seems to me that, and Prime Minister Netanyahu made a point of thanking President Trump, Jason Greenblatt, Jared Kushner for their help in resolving the impasse over Temple Mount. Now, what does that mean? It means that they brokered a compromise. Well, that means they told Netanyahu to take the barriers down, and it shows that they are themselves appeasement-minded. Maybe. I am concerned that may be the case. It also may be the case that there's another set of games being played here. Almost certainly that is true. They were in talks with Jordan. Now, Jordan's king is weak. He is beset by Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood. He is ducking and weaving all the time to keep on his throne. Jordan is very vulnerable to Islamist takeover. And I guess that America and Israel believe that however terrible the king is, and he is terrible because he's constantly saying terrible things about Jews and about Israel, they probably think however terrible he is, worse will follow, so they have to keep him in power. So,
first piece of news, we're now in the 9 days. The 9 days when the Jewish people are supposed to be focused on the destruction of the temple and the centrality of the temple in Jerusalem to the Jewish people. Never before has the temple been such a headline news for the Jewish people before. So even though it came up to the headline news because of a terror attack, but all of a sudden the Jewish people are talking about the temple. That's my optimist side.
So it's interesting what he said was Netanyahu came out this morning at his Security Council or at his cabinet meeting and said, I'm in tune with this. I understand everybody's feelings, but, I made the decision and I have to, I carry the weight of security of Israel on my shoulders, and I had to make what I thought was the best decision. There's things about, he says here, that we are facing, some of which the wider public are not aware of and which I cannot detail. I understand public feeling. I also understand the duty of leadership, of what it is to sit in this chair and carry on my shoulders the ultimate responsibility for Israel's security, and I am acting accordingly. But it was interesting what Avi said in that we need to send him a audio thing to help him with his audio a little bit. He does great videos, and but sometimes his audio is not that great. But in the Israeli National News this morning, Dr. Martin Sherman, who's taught about this, he's a non-observant Jew, and he's like, he says, I was always skeptical towards the claim of my more devout kinfolk that the Temple Mount was the key to the maintenance of Jewish sovereignty over Israel. And he comes out in an editorial Friday in Israel National News and says, I was wrong. It really is important to the sovereignty of Israel. He thought it was religious fanaticism, although I still hold the view that if Israel is to remain viable as the nation state of the Jews, it cannot agree to surrendering sovereignty over Judea Samaria. I am today far more open to the claim that control over the Temple Mount is the key to sustaining Jewish sovereignty, not because of any strategic imperative, but because of a psycho-political one, not because Jewish zealots see it that way, but because Muslim zealots do. Although I still hold the view that if Israel, I broke that down into two. Nothing will do more to sustain the Muslims' belief that they can uproot the Jewish presence in all of the land of Israel, or even at least eradicate Jewish sovereignty over it, than successfully challenging Jewish control over the Jews' most sacred site. In Muslim eyes, if they cannot prise loose the Jews' hold over the Temple Mount, if they can prise loose the Jews' hold over the Temple Mount, they can prise it loose over any other site in the land. For them, if the Jews are willing to forego control over the Temple Mount to avoid an outburst of Muslim rage, they will be just as ready to forego such control over Haifa and Tiberias. For if the Jews are perceived as willing to take a stand over the most sacrosanct location in the heart of their capital, why would they be willing to make a sustained stand over any other less sacrosanct location whenever a pretext for conflict arises? And then this is someone who tweeted this week, Palestinian Authority now uses half of all foreign aid to reward terror. Then the article goes on to quote Dr. Mordecai Kedar, who is a former IDF person. He's a lecturer on Israeli-Arab relations. He reads Arabic, he understands Arabic, and this was his quote in a related article that Dr. Sherman referred to. Islam came into being in order to dispossess Judaism and everything that once belonged to the Jews. That is how the land of Israel became Palestine. That the Temple Mount turned into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The patriarch Abraham became the first Muslim, and King Solomon is said to have built a mosque in Jerusalem. Jewish presence and activity in Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount are perceived as Judaism's return to the status of a living, breathing religion. Muslims who realize the theological challenge of this poses are unable to deal with it. So if I'm going to have to go 3 minutes over. I know we have communion after. I want to talk about this. This is waiting for Israel's next northern storm. We've talked about this And it's in context in that this is Nasrallah saying we're going to have many more volunteers in the next Hezbollah-Israel war. You see the squiggly yellow line there near the top of the page. That's the Lebanon-Israel border. You see the Golan Heights there to the right of the Sea of Galilee, just above Nasrallah's video window. And this is happening. This is very important. Now, and I'll give Jacob Prasch credit for bringing this up because I personally didn't make the connection. There was this finding. It was published this week in the American Journal of Genetics, I think it's called, and it was republished in a National Geographic site. Living descendants of biblical Canaanites identified via DNA. Now, what they said was, oh, look, they found 5 bodies buried in clay pots, and they did their DNA, and then they compared it to a bunch of people that live in southern Lebanon. And what they found is the DNA of the Canaanite bodies that they'd found down in Israel matched the DNA of the people that live in southern Lebanon. Now, they say, oh, well, see, that disproves the Bible because the Canaanites were wiped out. But I think that was one of the problems with Israel was they didn't wipe out the Canaanites. And the interesting thing, and this is Jacob Prasch's point, in Bible prophecy, we know that the sons of Ishmael, the Arabs, will oppose Israel in the end times, the Jewish state of Israel, and Jews will be gathered back in the land. We know from Ezekiel 38 and other passages that the Persians will oppose Israel. And Jacob asked the question, isn't it interesting now that southern Lebanon, which is Hezbollah, which is funded by the Persians, appear to be the descendants of the Canaanites? That's a very significant finding. So kudos to Jacob for bringing it up. More than 90% of the genetic ancestry of modern Lebanese is derived from ancient Canaanites, according to a paper published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. And so Jacob goes on to say, and so this is a site of Shiloh, and in the lower left-hand corner, you see a little covered area. Just if you go up, straight up that way, that's where the tabernacle stood at Shiloh for almost 400 years. And Jacob suggested that, well, they've got this DNA thing down to where they can get it from bone and do the comparison. So if they go to sites here and find Jewish bodies, will they be able to tie them to the Jews of today? Because it does appear in some prophecy passages that they'll be able to tie them together. And this has never happened in history, that they've been able to do this from a genetic DNA, scientific, microscopic standpoint. And so, you know, and now we have all this, there's all this stuff going on the border up there. ISIS is, now they're saying they've killed 60 to 7,000, but there could be upwards of 20,000 that are still running around loose, and what are we going to do? And it's a terrible thing. And there are conferences going on about Jerusalem and Baku, Azerbaijan. So look, here's the point I want to make. I have said in the past that I look at aspects of Bible prophecy and I have very mixed emotions about it. Because I know when certain things start to unfold and there are wars prophesied, and we don't know when those wars are relative to the 70th week of Daniel. We know there's a giant conflagration at the end called Armageddon. But, you know, we have Ezekiel 38 and 39, and some believe that Psalm 83 is a war. But there is a perpetual state of conflict prophesied. And so I have mixed emotions. When I see the Jews, like Avi says, we're talking about the temple now like we've never talked about in modern Israel history. in Israel, everybody's talking about the temple and the Temple Mount. And we see Jews going up there and wanting to pray, like other people go up there and pray. Well, like Muslims go up there and pray. Christians can't do it either. And I know that Temple Mount in Jerusalem isn't, we know God favors it. And we know God favors the land and has a plan to work out in the land. Now, I know that the temple, when the next temple that should be built, won't save anybody in terms of how Christians are saved. Judaism changed in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed because they lost the sacrificial system. They want to get the sacrificial system back, but Jesus covered all that with his work on the cross. And so my question is, that I'll leave you with today is, what do we do about that? Because I'm sure you have mixed emotions too. And somebody that I know and respect wrote, asked the question, how should we pray in these times? What should we pray for? And what we know is that the 70th week will have this temple aspect to it. Whether we like, and we know it's not going to save anybody. I get that, okay? But, in Thessalonians it talks about when they say peace and safety. And sometimes my concern is that, we don't know what all's going to happen before we're out of here, okay? But you can make a pretty good argument there's a bunch of stuff that's going to happen. And are we praying for peace and safety like the world is praying for? Remember Daniel in Daniel chapter 9, when Daniel was reading Jeremiah and saw that the 70-year captivity in Babylon was about to be to an end, what did he do? He prayed. And he prayed, God, first he repented on behalf of his people for all of the sins and wrong things they had done in their relationship with God. And he essentially prayed that God fulfill your prophecy just as you predicted so that you will be glorified. That's very fractured paraphrase of what that long passage in Daniel 9 before the 70-week prophecy is given. And my suggestion is we know that 70th week is not going to unfold as long as the Muslims are in control or think they're in control of the Temple Mount. And so do we pray that even though we know all the bad things that come about it, we know what the end result is, that Christ returns in glory and sets up his kingdom. And so are we on board with maybe praying that all that happen, even if it means that in the short term it's going to be very uncomfortable for us? I think we should. I was struck by it a lot this week that, and so we know that eventually the Jewish nation will be, the remnant that survives will be redeemed, and they will enter the millennial kingdom as the head of the nations under the rule of Messiah. So do we want to see that end point, even though we know all the stuff in between? And I personally do. And so I would just encourage us to pray to that end. So let's pray and get to communion. Father, thanks for your word. Lord, I pray that you will keep us focused on our duties in this time, that we would pray that you would fulfill your prophecies just as the scripture says, to your glory, and that you will give us a heart to pray that way, and in the meantime to share the gospel and explain these things to as many people as possible. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.